And to talk about the U.S. elections, we're joined by two ladies, Laurie, Laird, world affairs commentator, and Esther, Krakue, British broadcaster and columnist. Let me start with Laurie Laird. Given the tied vote between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, what implications does these have on the race itself?
So difficult to tell right now. And we've covered a lot of close elections, but my gosh, this one really is too close to call. I think the one thing that we can be sure of is that we won't have a winner tonight. Back in 2020, we didn't get the winner until the Saturday after the Tuesday elections. I'd expect we may even be a little later this time around. So I think you and I may be talking a number of times over the next couple of days.
How about unique voting timing for those in Dixville Notch at midnight? Do you think they have anything to do with trends in early voting across the country? Will this have any impact whatsoever on voter turnout as well as engagement?
It's an excellent question. I think Dixville Notch is more a curiosity than anything else. It doesn't really have much predictive power. I'm happy to, as you said earlier, the vote in Dixville Notch was tied, 3 votes apiece after a painstaking tally. Happy to hear that it doesn't sound like either candidate has demanded a recount there. But you have touched upon something that I think will be very important, and that's the presence of early voting. We're getting indications that record numbers of Americans have voted early, and a lot of the pollsters are sort of struggling to figure out how to account for this early voting. Almost half of Americans voted ahead of Election Day in 2020, and there's every indication it could be more this time around. So that is very difficult to account for in the polling. The Democrats are saying that early voting tends to favor them, but I'm hearing some Republican pollsters say that they are seeing a higher incidence of Republican registration. A lot of people trying to infer things from this, but I do think it could skew the polling. So the polls that we see now may not accurately reflect voter sentiments.
Well, let me get a perspective of Esther regarding tied vote between Kamala Harris as well as Donald Trump. Do you think this would have any impact whatsoever on the election, in totality?
This is the thing, it's difficult to kind of gauge where the election is turning because of the rise of early voting. You don't know the actual decisions that were imperative that people made before they cast their vote. So you could have people that have voted early that could potentially have swung their vote a week later if new news comes to light, or if different factors have changed, or maybe they have looked at the polls and think, actually, this candidate doesn't really stand a chance. So this is one of those unique circumstances that because we have such high incidence of early voting, we have actually really high incidence of Republican early voting, which is bucking the trend because it's not the norm. Usually Republicans vote on the day. They don't really have a high turnout when it comes to early voting. It's really, really hard to tell. And of course, this election will come down to a handful of swing states. And even then, gauging the actual data is different, not just because, they all have sort of different rules electorally, but also because different districts manage their voting processes so differently. So not only are we going to get the results quite later on, but it's really, really hard to gauge. That's why the election seems to be on such a knife edge.
How about the endorsement we've seen, particularly that from the New York Post of Trump, influencing voter behavior? Do you see that happening anyway? Such endorsement from them? Do you see that influencing voter behavior in favor of Trump, particularly undecided voters?
Well, the question is, how much do endorsements from various media outlets actually impact the voters? So to put it bluntly, how many voters are sitting there waiting for the endorsement of the New York Post or the Washington, the New York Times or whatever publication to actually cast their vote? That's very dubious. I think in this election, there are very few undecided voters. Most people have made up their minds way before whichever celebrity or media outlet endorses whichever candidate. The peculiar thing, though, is that there are many outlets, about 200 of them, that previously endorsed Biden that have taken a step back and have decided to remain neutral this election, all of whom are American media outlets. I mean, in Europe and Britain and Europe, like The Economist and all of that, we've expected loads of these publications have already taken a position. But actually, a lot of mainstream media outlets and magazines and publications in the US have decided to take a step back. Jeff Bezos' organization, for example, being a case in point, which is peculiar because these publications have a history, a track record of endorsing candidates. So it's really, you have to question the motivation behind that. Is it because the media landscape has become so fragmented that whoever wins, they don't want to necessarily have pigeonholed themselves to one side and effectively hemorrhage viewers and an audience? Or is it because they really don't see the point of endorsing anyone? It's actually affecting their credibility and neutrality. So this is quite a game changer election, not just in terms of the candidates, but also in terms of how it's influencing the media landscape and the decision that these executives are taking.
Laurie, what's your line of thought in terms of demography? Do you think that should be examined in the poll results to better understand, support levels for Trump or Harris?
Well, I mean, Esther has made a really good point about endorsements. And I think we've had a lot of discussion about endorsements this time around because of Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, which has tended to be a left-leaning publication. He came out and said, we're not going to endorse anyone. We think voters can make up their own minds. And there's some sense to that, although a lot of people wondered whether Jeff Bezos was looking at his bottom line and looking at his business interests and wanting to stay on the right side of whoever gets elected. But you mentioned one thing I'm fascinated by, and maybe Esther has some thoughts on this because I'm not very hip or trendy, but the prevalence of celebrity endorsements for Kamala Harris. We've had so many Hollywood figures, Oprah Winfrey, Taylor Swift, coming out to endorse Kamala Harris, these well-known names. And I can't get my head around whether this will make a difference, particularly with younger demographics. These are the flakiest of voters. Joe Biden, bizarrely, for the oldest president we've ever seen, did very, very well with younger voters, better, in fact, than Barack Obama did. As these voters are flaky, will they come out or not? Are they influenced by these celebrity endorsements? And on the other side, do people who tend to support the Republicans feel almost talked down to by what they consider to be elites, telling them how to vote? So I'm of two minds on how these endorsements can work. Maybe they cut both ways.
Let's talk about timing. Looking at the timing of the polls, we've seen one conducted just days before the election. Do you think that would affect responses of likely voters?
I'm sorry to jump in here. I think Esther really hit this very well. And there are big questions about how these polls will affect people. And will people look at polls? And they are quite tight, but different polls in different states may say something different. Do people say, I'm turned off by the whole process, I may not go? How does polling affect turnout on the day is a very, very big question. I think another thing to be aware of this time around, and it sounds a little bit like I'm digressing a bit, but I think it's quite important. There are 10 states in which there'll be abortion rights, reproductive rights on the ballot. Now, I'm not sure if polling will accurately reflect people who may go out, may be completely turned off by the political process. And I'm getting the sense anecdotally, there are a lot of people who feel that way, but they may be sufficiently concerned about reproductive rights to go to the polls and simply vote on that referendum. Two of these referendums are in swing states, Arizona and Nevada. And I'm wondering if polling will reflect people who go to vote on reproductive rights, and when they get into that booth, decide that they'll check a box for a presidential candidate, even if they weren't inclined to do so when they went out, when they got up in the morning to get a vote on reproductive rights. It's not clear to me that polling will accurately reflect that little wrinkle in things.
How about you, Esther? What are your thoughts on timing of the poll? We've seen one which was, conducted just days before the election. Do you think that, that has any impact whatsoever on responses of likely voters?
I think it really is probably going to follow the trends that have already been established in the past, which is that the kinds of voters that Republicans tend to galvanize, which is white, blue-collar, working class, predominantly men, they are the hardest to poll, actually, just because they don't really respond to pollsters. I mean, I would be interested to look at sort of the data and statistics around poll fatigue. How exhausted are Americans of this process of constantly being called up by pollsters, having months and even years of campaigning and different media sort of stories shoved down their throats. I mean, it's quite a contrast to many countries in Europe that limits their electoral campaigning to basically 6 weeks and have some sort of cap on the amount of money you can spend. There have been billions spent in this campaign alone. And, yes, it's understandable a country the size of basically a continent having so many electoral processes and having to vote for so many offices. But there is an element of fatigue there. So I think that the trends that we see will hold in terms of polling. So the more likely Democratic voters, the women, particularly urban women and all of that, they're more likely to respond. So that can skew a lot of the data, which is why sometimes you hear pollsters talk about hidden or reluctant Trump voters that just don't engage with pollsters. And so it's really hard to engage. I just wanted to make a quick point on the celebrity endorsements. It's also interesting because we don't actually have any studies, recent studies, to see how celebrity endorsements actually impacts voter behavior. Again, the ultimate question is who sits there waiting for the endorsement of Oprah Winfrey or Taylor Swift to cast their votes, bearing in mind these people live completely different lives from the average person. So the outcome of elections will likely not affect their lifestyles in one way or another. So it's quite interesting. I mean, we've seen Kamala Harris basically shrouded in celebrity. She's had every big name under the sun basically come out for her, including previous Republicans like Dick Cheney. But, Trump has gone kind of the average man route, has really been galvanizing the internet, particularly male-dominated space, and has been kind of going after many celebrities in that field as well. So, I personally am dubious of the efficacy of those sorts of methods because I think actually voting patterns are deeply personal. People tend to vote on their top three priorities, which it would seem in this election are the economy, immigration, and somewhere down the line is probably reproductive rights. So it'll be quite interesting to see where the whole hidden voter or the people that just don't engage with pollsters will fall, whether they'll break more on the Democrat side or the Republican side.
Well, indeed, thank you so much for your time on the news. Esther Krakue, a British broadcaster and columnist. Many thanks indeed. I will still stay with you, Laurie Laird. Right now, let's connect with our correspondent in Washington, D.C. That's our Chief International Correspondent, Afua Hagan. Afua, just paint a picture for us of what's happening where you are. Are people out there voting?
Well, it's 30 minutes until the polls actually open here in Washington, D.C. The sun is just coming up, so it's all quiet here at the moment. But yesterday really was a day of the city getting ready for the election and getting ready for potentially impending violence. Washington, D.C., quite quiet, shops being boarded up throughout the city. Remember, this is the capital of the United States, so quite unusual to see. It's a city really bracing itself. But like I said, 30 minutes until polls open in Washington, D.C., and we will surely be out there for you.
Well, talking about those who have come out to, cast their votes, how would you describe the demography of those who have come out today?
Well, what we're really seeing from early voting, and I believe the last early voting numbers I had was about 80 million people have cast their early votes, and that's over half of the 150 million people that are expected to vote. And what we are seeing, especially across swing states, is we are seeing much more Republicans voting than early voting than before. About 36% of Republicans have used early voting. That's up from about 30% in 2020. We're seeing a lot more older white women using early voting, around 54% of early votes as well. And I think we will be seeing in this election a record amount of early votes cast. Will that mean that we get a later result? We're not entirely sure. Perhaps it may mean, in 2020, we had a lot more mail-in votes, and that meant that it took a lot more time to count the votes, which is why it took 5 days to get the result. But what we are seeing from early voting in record numbers, and more people, more older white women, more Republicans voting early than ever before.
Afua, I wonder what your thoughts are regarding the timing of polls. We've seen just before the election conducted, people casting their votes already. Does that in any way affect responses of likely voters?
Well, it can do. I think Laurie made a really good point earlier on, as did Esther. Is that people might think, if these votes have already been cast, does my vote count? How does the polls affect how people feel about voting today if they haven't voted already? I think undecided are no longer undecided. They would have made up their mind by now. And I think polls, they don't always get it right, do they? Sometimes they get it very, very wrong. And especially Trump supporters are underpolled. They're shyer about telling pollsters or anybody who calls from this newspaper, that newspaper, or that polling company who they will vote for. So I think, yes, perhaps we can look at the polls this year. Apparently they have been adjusted to try and include more Trump supporters and try and be more accurate and reflective of that. So perhaps we can look at the polls where they are now, and they are pretty much in a dead heat and have been for such a long time. So perhaps we could look at them as accurate. And I think, you know, the polls definitely affect the way that people will think about the election, but also affect the way the candidates and the campaigns will go about the election as well. I mean, the Trump campaign have been really, really optimistic, perhaps until this week, and insiders in the Trump campaign, you know, muttering things like the bottom has fallen out of the campaign, that they're not as positive as they were perhaps 7 days ago. The Harris campaign always remaining cautiously optimistic. I think one phrase that he used was nauseously optimistic as well, trying to keep humble and remaining the underdogs throughout the campaign.
Well, thank you so much for bringing context to this U.S. election happening. Our Chief International Correspondent, Afua Hagan. Let me come back to you, Laurie. I mean, we've seen, towards the build-up of this election, various campaigns. Today, seems to mark the D-Day. Let me get your perspective. If these election swings either way for Trump, if he emerges the winner, what should we expect, for America and the world at large? If it swings in favor of Kamala Harris, what should we expect for America and the world at large?
Excellent question, particularly because both of these campaigns have been very, and to my mind, frustratingly light on policy, particularly economic policy, which is one of my specialties, but also what voters tell pollsters consistently that they care the most about. And there's a funny dichotomy going on here, because Americans will tell pollsters that they feel pretty good about their financial situation, that they feel optimistic, their finances are in good shape, in as good shape as they were 4 years ago. They also tell pollsters that they feel that the economy is not doing well. So it seems quite inconsistent, but it feels like particularly the Democrats have shied away from economic policy. And when Kamala Harris has discussed economic policy, she hasn't looked particularly confident. Donald Trump has talked about it a little more, but mostly in the context of Kamala Harris broke the economy, she caused inflation, which is completely nonsensical. I think both of the candidates, let me turn this around. Neither of the candidates is what would be considered a free trader. Both Donald Trump calls himself tariff man. He wants to put tariffs on every import that comes in to the United States. Bizarrely, this argument plays very well with the electorate, despite the fact that ultimately tariffs make goods more expensive, and that's reflected in the price that consumers pay. They tend to be inflationary. A lot of Americans tell pollsters that they don't want any more inflation. Kamala Harris has been a little bit quieter. She has talked about perhaps fighting inflation by investigating whether supermarkets are artificially raising the prices of things. That's also a nonsensical argument. There's very little evidence that that is happening. But she has not talked about, Joe Biden kept all of Donald Trump's tariffs from his first term. Harris has not talked about rolling this back. So this age of globalization, of free trade that has helped so many countries, including a lot of African nations, it's not going to ground to a halt, but it will certainly make it more difficult for countries to trade with each other. And of course, developing nations, trade has been the way that developing nations have gone from poorer countries to middle-income countries. We could see definitely a halt to that process.
Well, thank you so much for your thoughts on the news, Laurie Laird, World Affairs commentator. Many thanks indeed.